I'm aware as I start recording this that a lot more than some of my other videos, this runs the risk of coming off in a way that's just like, this thing really annoys me because it affects me in a way that I find annoying. And it's that a little bit. Because stripped down to its bare essentials, this is kind of just me complaining about a type of guest that I'm forced to encounter at work. But bear with me though, because I think there is genuine insight here, and the topic at hand is one that's more interesting than just a type of guy I don't like. So for the last 3.5 years, I've been working in a cinema. I started there in 2020 on Valentine's Day, so I did like three and a half weeks of work, and then I went onto furlough. We were in lockdowns, and the reason I bring that up right away is just to point out that I never had cinema experience pre-lockdown, because a lot of this video is going to be me comparing people's attitudes towards film and film distribution prior to the pandemic versus the way that people seem to think and feel about it now. But unfortunately, I don't have the personal experience of having worked in a cinema environment prior to the lockdowns. So this is my first time working specifically in the industry. But I've always been a cinema person, I've always been a film person, I've always been involved in fandom, and I've noticed a shift in the way that people seem to feel about film distribution in the years since we started going into lockdowns back in 2020. In particular, they're a lot less... Fuck off. In particular, they're a lot less patient now, they're a lot more entitled, a lot more demanding. They want... Oh my god! They want the freedom to consume the media they want in whatever format and at whatever time is the most convenient for them personally. And obviously I understand that. Everyone in the world would. I'm someone that also likes consuming the media the way and at the time that I like. But for one, I do, I guess, just kind of want to mindlessly complain about it just a tiny little bit, because as someone that works in a cinema, anytime a guest doesn't get the way they want, they decide to make the conscious decision to make it my personal problem to fix, even though all I'm doing is trying to get through 8 hours of people asking me if a large popcorn is bigger than a medium. But on the other hand, when it comes to film distribution, and especially like theatrical releases versus streaming and home media releases, I have noticed a really big shift in attitudes pre and post lockdowns that I do find really interesting and want to talk about. And it rears its head, especially when part one of a film gets released. Now, obviously, these are nothing new. Films have been made, split into multiple parts for as long as I've been alive, as long as I've been watching films. But since we've started coming out of lockdowns, there have been a bunch of them. Like, obviously, we had Dune Part 1 in 2021. Fuck, that delivery was bad. We had Dune Part 1 in 2021, and Part 2 was slated for this year, but I think is going to be pushed back to 2024 now. This year saw the releases of Across the Spider-Verse, which is obviously going to get Beyond the Spider-Verse next year, in theory, and which was originally promoted as Across the Spider-Verse Part 1, and then next year's film was going to be Across the Spider-Verse Part 2. We have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. We have Fast X Part 1, which I'm not really going to touch on at all because that's not one of the big ones. But the thing is, the increased impatience and entitlement of moviegoers is something that I've already been conscious of and wanted to talk about and script into a video. But, like I said, it's most noticeable when the first half of a two-half film comes out. So I want to just talk about that for a bit, and I guess talk about the way people feel about that and what they think of it and why and what that all means, I guess. Like I said, films being released in multiple parts is nothing new. I know Back to the Future Part 1 didn't say to be continued at the end of it, but Part 2 said to be concluded, and then it had footage of the third film before the credits rolled. I think like 6 months later, in 1990, the third part was released, and that wasn't common for the 80s or 90s. I'm not pretending that was happening constantly. I'm just trying to make a point that it's absolutely not something that like the 2020s invented. This was happening before I was even born. Kill Bill was released in 2 volumes like 6 months apart in the same year in the early 2000s, and that's like a really famous example. Tarantino famously considers that to just be one film that he had to split into 2 for distribution reasons. The second and third Matrix films were shot back to back, and then they were released 6 months apart in the same year. And then more recently, And more relevantly, 4 very popular series of fantasy novels aimed at children and teenagers were adapted into film series. There was the Divergent franchise, and then there were the Hunger Games films before that, and then before that there was the Twilight films, and before that there was the other one. Twilight Breaking Dawn was split into 2 parts and released in 2011 and 2012. Mockingjay was split into 2 parts and released in 2014 and 15. My memory might be bad. Allegiant was originally going to be 2 films. It was going to be Allegiant Part 1 and Part 2, and then it was going to be Allegiant and Ascendant, and then in 2016 they released Allegiant, and it fucking sucked. Allegedly. I haven't seen it. And then the second one was cancelled. And then they toyed with the idea of turning it into a TV show, I think, and then that just didn't happen. And then the finale novel of that other fantasy series was turned into 2 films as well. And the thing is, it turns out that was a really good decision, like financially and from a marketing perspective, because do you want to know what happens when you take a very popular series of films that have garnered like millions of adoring fans, and you tell them that you're splitting the last one up into 2 and that they're going to get an extra movie? It generates a fucking insane amount of hype. Now, I wasn't watching these series of films when they were coming out. I wasn't keeping caught up on them, apart from Hunger Games, I guess. But I was a teenager and a young adult when they were coming out. I turned 18 in 2014, so I was very much like in the demographic around the time that they were getting released. So I was surrounded everywhere by a peer group of people who loved these films. And the decision to take each of the finale films and turn them into 2 and release them like 6 months or a year apart was really popular. And I know part of that is just that they're based on books that people already are familiar with and enjoy. And if they've watched 7 films, they're not going to just like skip out on the last part, you know. They want to see the story that they already like adapted in its entirety. But then in equal measure, fans just really enjoyed these specific actors' portrayals of the character. They really liked and appreciated these filmmakers' visions for these stories that they were already really invested in. And obviously some people were just enjoying the films in their own right with no knowledge of the source material, or they were even being directed to the source material because they watched and enjoyed the films first. That's the point where I'm going to kind of stop talking about Divergent, because very famously they did really badly and tanked at the box office and nobody liked them, and then the last one was cancelled. And this is this is a conversation about how these are very popular, so I'm going to kind of drop that one. But there's something I want to point out, a little point I want to make about the other 3. Wizard Book Part 7, the second film... I potentially couldn't have worded that in a worse way. Wizard Movie Number 7 Part 2 was far and away the best performing film in that entire series. It blew all of the other ones out of the water. It was the only one to make over $1 million except for the first film. It even beat the first film by like $100,000. It was far and away the highest grossing entry in the entire series. When it comes to the Twilight franchise, Breaking Dawn Part 1 ended up being the 2nd highest performing film in the entire franchise. The highest performing one ended up being Part 2. And that, again, it beat it by over $100,000. Like, these finale ones were very much the ones that performed the best in the cinema. That didn't end up being true for Hunger Games. Obviously, that didn't go down like the Divergent route of having cancellations and stuff, but the finale ones didn't end up being the most popular, but they were still very successful and they all still did really well. But the point I'm trying to make is people weren't getting like sick of these series. They weren't getting tired of these films. They wanted to keep going and seeing them. Like, the whole point of cliffhanger endings, and I know you know this, but the whole point of cliffhanger endings is to bring people back for the second half. I know 2-part films haven't always been a thing. Back to the Future might be the earliest one that I can think of off the top of my head, but cliffhanger endings have been a thing for as long as fiction has existed. And when that was popularized properly in the film industry, which I want to say was like late 2000s, 2010s, people responded well to it. People left the cinema like excited to come back in a year or in 6 months and see the rest of the film that they just watched. They were excited to see the second part of a story they were enjoying. There was also another time this happened, and I'll only touch on this one a little more briefly, because I'm kind of just retreading the same point that I was making just now. But it's important, so bear with me. So in 2014, Avengers Infinity War was announced. It was announced as Part 1. In 2016, it was just renamed to Avengers Infinity War, and they got rid of the Part 1. And then it was shot back to back with Avengers Endgame. Part 2 was turned into Endgame. They were the third and fourth Avengers films, respectively. They were also the 19th and 22nd films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And these ones weren't even released back to back either. Like, if you were keeping up with the MCU, you didn't even get just one of them and then a bit of a gap and then the next one. 2 films were released between them. I mentioned that they were the 19th and the 22nd films. The 20th and 21st were Ant-Man and the Wasp and Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel is another film I need to make a video about because I think it's garbage. But between Infinity War and Endgame, they released 2 other MCU films, and both of them had stuff in there that was crucial to understanding Endgame. Like, the 2 Avengers films weren't actually released that far apart, but you had to do 4 hours of homework essentially in between them. And I cannot stress this enough. I have lots of colleagues that worked in the cinema already in 2019. I have heard stories, and they talk about it genuinely like they were drafted into a war. Like, it's not just that it was the highest grossing Avengers film or the highest grossing MCU film, and it wasn't just that no other MCU film since then has managed to top it at the box office, even though it came out, nearly 5 years ago. It's also that it became the second highest grossing film ever made. This is part 2 of a film, of a franchise that is already like 20 films deep, and it became the second highest grossing film ever made. Literally ever. Like, the point I'm making is these things do well when you split a film into 2 and you allow more space to tell the story and do it more justice and flesh it out well. It does very well and everyone loves it. Traditionally. Again, these aren't all the examples. The It films, they were obviously split into 2, and people talked a lot about how it made sense to split that into 2 because of the novels, 2 parallel plot lines, so they just turned each one into a movie. But even before the release of the first one, people were saying that made sense, and then when it came out and it turned out to be good, it generated a lot of hype for the second one, and the second one came out 2 years later, and people liked it. They didn't like it as much as they liked the first one, but they did pretty well. This is just always how it's worked, especially if a film is attached to like a popular IP that people are already very attached to. A studio would go, oh, by the way, we're going to make this as 2 films. The one that's getting released now is part 1. This is part 1, and then there's going to be a part 2. We're going to release this one and you're going to watch it, and then in like 6 months or a year, you're going to get another one. To reiterate, right out of the gate, this is a part 1. And everyone would fucking love it, and they would see the first one and they would really enjoy it, and they would leave the cinema saying how much they enjoyed it and how excited they were to see the second one, and then they would return to see the second one. This was a marketing scheme that was like socially and commercially and financially very successful all the way from late 2000s all the way up to the end of the 2010s. And then everyone got the fucking coronavirus and now everyone's worse. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is one of the best films I've ever seen. It's in my top 4 on Letterboxd, and I've seen it 18 times. Back when Across the Spider-Verse was showing at the cinema I work at, I heard guests complaining, like sincerely complaining, sometimes to the team, that they had just wasted 2.5 hours of their lives because they didn't get a full movie. Like, they sat in that fucking screen for nearly 3 hours all told because of the ads and trailers, and it amounted to fucking nothing, and they wish they could get their time back. People said this about probably the best film I've ever seen. I haven't met or spoken to a single person that hasn't really liked Across the Spider-Verse, but in terms of just guests that I've encountered, like the general public of like moviegoers, people have been like really angry. I heard one woman say that the least the studio could do for wasting her time, the least the studio could do was release the second one in a few months. And it's staggering to me. And I think it would be staggering to me even if I didn't love the film, even if I wasn't like a Spider-Man fan, because it's a Spider-Man film. Like, I understood it a little bit. People were making a lot of the same complaints when Dune Part 1 came out, but the thing is, that's not as well known of a property. That's not a thing that people are already really attached to. So much so that people thought it was plagiarizing Star Wars, even though the book was written well before Star Wars was made. And I also understand it slightly with Dune, because as someone that's familiar with the story and as someone that's read the novel, it makes sense to me that they ended it in the place where they did. Narratively, structurally, I think the place they left off the first half makes perfect sense. But I also understand why people thought it was jarring, and I understand why people didn't think it was like a satisfactory film in its own right, and I understand people having those complaints. And that's especially because it's like a really long film. But like, again, a Spider-Man film? And people have been saying this about Dead Reckoning as well. I mean, Mission Impossible is a franchise that, as far as I can tell, is getting more popular with every installment. Fallout, the previous one, is like widely considered to be one of the best ones, if not the best one. And they've decided that they're that they're going to split this movie into two, that the seventh movie is going to be the seventh and eighth installments. And again, I know 8 films is a lot of films. I know that that's a long franchise. But again, 2 of the most popular examples that I've already talked about were the 7th and 8th, and then, again, 19th and 22nd installments in a franchise. And as I mentioned before, they blew every prior entry out of the water. But I don't know, based on my memory and my knowledge of those other franchises and how well most of the concluding entries did, and how successful it was of a marketing strategy splitting the films up that way. Like, with that knowledge, it just really strikes me as odd that people are seeing To Be Continued at the end of a Spider-Man film, and they're leaving angry. Spider-Man fans are angry that they're going to have to watch another Spider-Man film. And I know that that's like a reductive way to put it. I know that that's a silly little goofy way to word it that makes it sound stupid. But is that not... is that not what it is? Are people not just annoyed that they're going to have to watch another superhero film about a superhero that they really like? But my understanding of the way film distribution has adapted and changed over the last few years, here's where that's going to come into play. So I think genuinely that the pandemic really hurt most people's threshold for consuming media. It was a big era for TikTok. It was a big era for streaming services. People wanted their media consumption to be very brief and very snappy, and they wanted it to be very immediate. And I think it really hurt people's ability to be patient with long-form media, and hurt people's ability to sit through something that dragged on for too long. I think there's a direct link between the amount of time people spent streaming media at home and scrolling through social media and the lack of patience they have now. But then in equal measure, so on the one hand you have people wanting their media consumption to be very like snappy and very like fed to them very quickly, and they don't have patience for anything long. On the other hand, the other sort of thing that the pandemic did was it allowed people to watch all of a franchise in a row, just kind of uninterrupted. The lockdowns were huge for binge watching. I know people that watched like all 9 seasons of The Office in like a week, or watched the entire MCU back to back in a handful of days. I actually did that this year. It didn't take me a handful of days, but I watched the MCU again, and you'll never guess, most of it's bad. And I have more thoughts on that. I'm going to be making a Captain Marvel video at some point. But back to my main point. I was absolutely in that camp too. I was one of those people who was consuming media at just like such a rapid fire rate, because it's a good way to like kill time but also keep yourself entertained. It's very mindless. You can do other stuff while you're doing it. And I'm also someone, and I know tons of people like this, I'm someone that struggles to get into something until I know it's concluded, especially with like a TV show. If I know it's still airing, I sometimes can struggle to start getting into it. I want to know that I can sit down and watch every episode of a TV show, and then that's just it. And I think having just an infinite amount of time in your home with like very little to do, You know, people were getting a little bit stagnant in lockdowns, and I think it gave people a good opportunity to finally get around to a bunch of the TV shows especially, but also film series, whatever, that they'd been meaning to get around to. And the thing is, it was very easy to do that, logistically. I'm not talking just about, like, time consumption. I'm talking about, like, your ability to have it, like, right in front of you immediately. People could consume an entire franchise worth of content on demand at the click of a button and all in one go. Like, it was very much an era of instant gratification media-wise. People's attitudes changed, but specifically people's expectations changed, and I think that's the biggest factor here. People's expectations and people's idea of, like, the bare minimum level of accessibility to media changed, and the expectation became that everything would be available immediately and conveniently. Once people were coming out of lockdowns, once everything was starting to slowly open and stuff was getting distributed theatrically, once people were trying to be pushed back to the cinema, distribution had to accomplish two things at once in a way that it hadn't before. It had to incentivize people to get out to the cinema, it had to drive business, it had to push people to get out of their home and to the movies, but then it also had to accommodate people that either couldn't do that or didn't want to. So film distribution had to operate in a way where it ensured the fucking industry didn't die, but then it also had to accommodate people who were still stuck at home. And the way films were released changed drastically in that period of time, and it wasn't related to or in response to people's newfound, like, expectation that media be delivered right to their fingertips right when they wanted it. It wasn't to feed that expectation, but it definitely did exacerbate it. Because of the way that the film industry tried to boost engagement in 2020 and then, you know, dribbling into 2021 and 2022, audiences became very accustomed, and I would argue too accustomed, to films being released in the cinema, but then also being released on streaming either at the same time or a few days later or a few weeks later. Or even in cases like Mulan, where it was just, like, streaming exclusive. I know that that distribution model failed immediately, putting it behind a paywall the way that they did. But so stuff was either released just so that you could just watch it at home straight away, or it was released into the cinema, but then either simultaneously or shortly after it was also released on streaming. And that wasn't the case for every film, especially huge blockbusters like Avatar 2. Avatar 2 showed in the cinema for a long time, and then there was a period where it wasn't accessible anywhere, and then it went to streaming, which is more of a traditional release strategy. That's how stuff always used to get distributed. But it was pretty common for stuff to be showing in the cinema and streaming online at the same time. And we're still not actually completely out of that era yet. There's still plenty of examples of films that are available on streaming that we still have showing in the cinema. And sometimes that's only like a performance or two a day, right? It's not the stuff that's huge and new and popular. Again, it's not the blockbuster stuff. But we do have examples of stuff still that's available online, but also available to come and see in the cinema if you so wish. And that's kind of nuts to me. I'm still not fully adjusted to that, even though it's been, like, the normal thing for the last few years. It's crazy to me that it's still like that. Because the way the model always used to work, the way film distribution always used to work is, you know, if you want to see a film as early as possible, you have to make the trip out to the cinema and you have to pay a bunch of money. And if you're not willing to do that, or if you're not able to do that, then you have to wait a little bit longer, and then you have to wait for it to go to, like, a paid streaming service, and then if you don't want to do that, you have to wait even longer than that, and then you have to get it on fucking Blu-ray. And we are definitely returning to that. And Spider-Man is a really good example of that. It was exclusively in the cinema, and then the day that we stopped showing it is the day that it went to streaming, and now I have it on DVD. You know, that is a way that films are getting distributed again, in a way that they used to before the pandemic. But even Spider-Man, when I check our competitors' website, if I look at the performances they have on, their cinema is closer to where I live, so I will admit I sometimes am going there. Every so often they just have a performance of Spider-Man. And it's like, out. Look, it's out. And sometimes the cinema that my one competes with are just still showing it. That's crazy. But the thing is, the way films were made very accessible very quickly during the pandemic has led people to, I think, believe genuinely that that's just the status quo now, that that's just the way it's going to be, even though it never was, and it isn't currently. And there was also just never any guarantee that it was going to stay that way. This was never something that was introduced as like the new way that films are getting distributed. This was very specifically a response to a pandemic. They were changes that were made to accommodate the fact that people were confined to their homes, but unfortunately it seems like a lot of people seem to think that the changes were made just to gratify them and for their personal convenience. You know, for every person in the lockdown that became way more active and way more productive, there was another person that became lazy and unproductive. I already explained in a previous video that I just became a lazy person. And I think people genuinely believed in their heart of hearts that film was being made more accessible to accommodate their laziness. I think it's a fairly understandable way to feel as well. I think this is something where if you aren't in the position I'm in, or if you don't care about the stuff I care about, if you're not someone that's looking into film distribution just because you find it interesting, if you're someone that's just sitting at home watching your films because you're in a pandemic, you know, you personally just start to wish that you didn't have to go out to the cinema to see a film, and then all of a sudden stuff is being delivered very quickly and conveniently to you. I understand completely feeling like those things are related and that one is in response to the other. But obviously the biggest problem with that is the assumption that accompanies that, which is that this is the norm now and it won't change back and films aren't going to become less accessible again. But the problem is, films are becoming less accessible again. We are once more operating in an environment where if you can't see a film at the cinema anymore, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can watch it elsewhere. It doesn't mean that there's a streaming release, it doesn't mean there's a home media release. It doesn't mean necessarily that there'll be like a good copy that you can find online to stream surreptitiously. Sometimes a film isn't showing in the cinema anymore, and that just means you can't watch it for a while. Like, there's less of a push to get people back out to the movies because people are already back out at the movies and have been for over like a year and a half. There's less of an urgency to streaming distribution because people aren't confined to their homes anymore. Like, as cinema attendance increases, the urgency for streaming release decreases. You know, the changes that I outlined previously were made to accommodate a state of living that most people just aren't in anymore. This is a return to the norm. This is a return to what things were like pre-pandemic. But in like several weeks after we stopped showing Spider-Man in the cinema, I had a guest approach me and ask me when we were next going to be showing it. And when I explained that we weren't, when I said, you know, oh, we stopped putting on performances of it because it's exclusively streaming online now, and I told him where I directed him to the correct streaming service, he got angry with me and became like verbally hostile towards me because he doesn't have an Amazon Prime subscription, as if that's my fault. You know, a Disney film or something will stop showing in the cinema and people will get angry that they can't see it because they don't want to pay for a Disney Plus subscription. And the thing is, I get not wanting to pay for a Disney Plus subscription, especially not wanting to pay for several streaming services alongside one another. But just like prior to the pandemic, sometimes the sacrifice that you make when you make that decision is that you just don't get to see the film that you want to see as quickly as you want to see it. Sometimes it just means you have to wait a month or 2 months or 3 months longer to see the fucking Little Mermaid or whatever, I don't know. But that's normal. That's fine. People have been saying for 3 years now that they want things to go back to the way they were before and they want things to get back to normal. This is things getting back to normal, but because it's getting back to normal in a way that makes things less accessible to them, they're becoming angry. You know, they'll spend 3 years saying they want things to get back to normal, and now we're in the late stages of things getting back to normal. And as soon as that means that things are less personally convenient for them, they'll yell at a minimum wage retail employee about it. This got away from me. This was supposed to be a video about part ones, but my point is that all of this stuff that I've already been describing is just amplified tenfold when just part one of a film is released. People have all of the impatience that I described and the frustration that I described and the desire for instant gratification. They've become very, very, very accustomed, again, too accustomed to being able to binge watch every entry in a franchise, including the newest one that got released a few weeks ago, just very rapidly. And not only do they take longer to access now, and it's longer before you're able to even see it in the first place, and sometimes you even have to leave your house and go and see it at the cinema, not only are all of those horrible crimes against them personally being committed, but also, by the time they do see the film, it's not even a full fucking movie. And again, this is how you end up with adult Superman. What? Not even the right fucking franchise. This is how you end up with adult Spider-Man fans saying that it should have been shorter, or they should have condensed it into one film, or that the first hour was boring, because literally all it did was establish all the character dynamics and the emotional stakes, as if that's important. And this is how you get people saying that they're going to hold off on even deciding if they like the film until they get to see the second one. That's something I've heard people say out loud, and I don't get it. People wouldn't like Across the Spider-Verse if it was shorter, because the characters and themes would be underdeveloped and the plot would feel rushed. But they also wouldn't like it if it was released as one 5-hour movie, because people are already complaining that the first half is too long, they're complaining that it drags, and they're coming out and telling me that their toddlers are bored and asking for their money back. The unavoidable middle ground between your film unavoidably being very long and audiences not wanting to go and see a film that's very long is you split it in half. That's always been the case. People used to understand that, like I said, and they also used to enjoy it because it meant that they were going to get more of a thing that they like. People weren't holding off on evaluating Infinity War or deciding what they thought of it until they'd had a chance to see Endgame, because that would have been ridiculous. People watched Infinity War and they both really, really loved it and then also wanted to know what was going to happen next. The same way normal people have always reacted to cliffhangers, right? It ends on a big moment of like uncertainty. It ends on this big dramatic moment where you don't know what's going to happen next, and you know you're going to have to wait to find out what happens next. And not only do you really enjoy the experience you just had in the film you just saw, but also, like I've explained, it makes you excited to see the next one. Infinity War was a movie in its own right, obviously, as well as being a part one, and the same is true for Across the Spider-Verse, and the same is true for all of the examples I've mentioned in the video. Across the Spider-Verse isn't meaningfully different from any of the other examples that I've listed in the video, except for the one big difference where it's better than all of them. But people are now looking at and regarding part one films in a new and worse and less critically complex way, specifically because the pandemic gave them incurable brain rot and like a terminal inability to just wait for stuff. Across the Spider-Verse is just as serviceable of a film as the part ones of all of the other stories that I've already mentioned. In fact, I would say in a lot of ways it's even stronger than all of those. It's just as serviceable as all the others. But because we're now in an era where COVID has bred like a new breed of moviegoer who becomes frustrated and enraged and starts vibrating and shaking and hitting people when they don't immediately get delivered all of the resolutions to every conflict in a story within a flat 95 minutes. People are only now, after, like I said, like 10 to 15 years of cliffhanger endings to popular stories doing nothing but generating hype for the next installment. Like, they're just, now it's just causing people to go, well, I don't know if I liked it. How am I meant to know if I liked it? I saw a 30-year-old man wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt walk out of a screen and say, I don't really know what I thought of it. I guess I'll find out next year. People weren't saying this stuff about the other ones, about all the stuff that came out 10, 15 years ago. And I know that because I was in the circles of people that were engaging with them and watching them and really excited to go and see all of them. People weren't complaining, or at least like the consensus wasn't that it was annoying. But from what I've observed of guests post-pandemic, whether it be Dune or whether it be Spider-Man, Mission Impossible, fucking Fast and Furious... fuck me. The consensus was just that it was normal, and also the films were good. And now, for some reason, the consensus among, like, the general public, among moviegoers, from what I've experienced in, like, witnessing guest behaviour, is that it's annoying. That they should either just release them at the same time, or back to back, or as one movie, because that's the fair thing to do. Because I want to see it now. Yeah, everyone wants to see it now. That's the thing. Every Spider-Man fan wants to see the next one now. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen. That's the point. If you're one of these people, if you're angry at Spider-Man, or if you just don't want to decide whether you like it because the second one wasn't released immediately, just relearn that sometimes it's okay to just have to wait for stuff. Like, I know that cliffhanger endings used to do their one job of incentivizing you to return for the concluding chapter, right? I know that this is a way that everyone has always been engaging with media forever. I know this is normal. I know everyone used to do it, and I know everyone can do it again. Not to be like old person nostalgia, I wish things were the way they used to be, but people used to leave the cinema talking about the possibilities for the future after they saw a film that they liked that ended but didn't answer all of their questions. People used to leave discussing it among themselves and speculating about what was going to happen next. And I have seen a lot of that with this. I have seen that, but mostly in, like, online spaces. I've seen people on the internet talking about what they think is going to happen in Beyond the Spider-Verse, but it's not really a discussion I've heard people having in the cinema or as they're leaving, or, like, directly after engaging with the film. People used to do that. People used to go out of the film and talk about what they'd just seen, and talk about what they thought it meant, and talk about what was going to happen in the story afterwards. But for some reason, people now are immediately discrediting a film they just watched just because it had the fucking audacity to end right as the characters were faced with, like, an insurmountable conflict. They were faced with this very, like, complex and difficult dilemma, and you don't know how they're going to get out of it. And instead of actually telling you, the film just ended. And everyone's just forgotten that that's just what a cliffhanger is. Just, like, learn to be patient again. Learn to just wait for the answers to the questions that you have, because that's supposed to be a satisfying experience. That's eventually getting the answers is supposed to be a nice feeling. You're supposed to feel frustrated, and you're supposed to feel unsatisfied, but you're supposed to feel that way specifically in a way where it motivates speculation and discussion and anticipation. Try to eliminate the part of your brain that wants a film to just be as, like, snappy and as concise as possible. I encountered recently, this isn't really relevant to the topic at hand, but I watched My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3, and that film is cut like shit. That film is cut really weirdly. It as a viewing experience, it's like any time there was an ounce of fat on the film, any time there was anything that wasn't immediately progressing the story, it was got rid of. And it's so jarring. So much is happening at you all the time, and it's not sitting with you for long enough. And I've noticed a lot of films are edited this way. This is just the most recent and one of the most egregious examples I can think of a film just being cut to absolute shit just for the sake of telling a story in 90 minutes. I didn't think My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 was a good film, but it could have done with being like an hour and 45 minutes long if it meant that the cutting and the editing wasn't as weird and wasn't as jarring and didn't feel like they were speed running the story, because that's the way that it felt. Like, try to eliminate the part of your brain that would rather watch someone on TikTok summarize the plot of a film in 2 minutes than actually just sitting and watching the film. Just learn to engage critically and emotionally with films again, especially ones that are as, like, rich and dense and complex as Across the Spider-Verse. And look forward to part 2 of this video, which I'll be posting in 6 months, in which I will be shooting myself with a gun in front of a guest for yelling at me.